Hello, Emily. Super cool to
Hello.
have you for this episode of my podcast. It's the sixth episode. I'm surprised I made it that far. I thought it would be an experiment over summer, and then I'll be, that's too much work. What was I thinking? But the
Hmm.
whole idea was that it would not really be work, but more like, you know what? I love having conversation with people in this community. And why not record some of them to share it with the
Yeah.
community? Because I feel like I learned so much from this kind of discussion.
Hmm.
And I know that not everybody is able to have this kind of discussion.
Hmm.
I mean, our community is pretty cool in that way. You can make connections, meet people at conferences and all. But still, I was privileged enough to first join a community when it was smaller, and so it was easier to network with especially long timer people who have been
Hmm.
studied with Steve and Kelly and all, and really spend some time at conferences and then even working together and all. So long story short, the idea was that, you know what, I know I will enjoy it, and I know I'm going to enjoy spending some time with you, just chatting about different topics as we usually do.
Hmm.
And if some people enjoy listening to us, that's cool too, you know.
I love
Thank
it.
you for that.
Yeah, thank you. What an awesome adventure. I'm excited to be part of it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So every time I record an episode, I have in mind that we're going to focus on a topic more or less, and we'll see where it goes. We also can talk about different things. And one thing that I'd like to talk about with you, perhaps a little more specifically, although it's a broad topic, is relationship with behaviorism. I know that
Hmm.
you, one of the persons in the CBS who's always been very attached to her behavioral roots. You and I
Yeah.
have talked about it many, many times. And even sometimes you were really like, I felt like you were like protecting almost our roots, defending them,
Yeah.
reaffirming them. One of those who continue to, I don't know if you still go to the ABA conference. You
Hmm.
still go? Okay.
Yep. Yep.
I'm guessing you're not crossing a lot of CBS people there, right?
Yeah, it's pretty limited. The crossover is pretty limited. Like the Venn diagram has slowly has
Hmm.
slowly
Yeah.
separated. But there are people that are ACBS people, I would
Yeah.
say, who
Yeah.
are either members of ACBS or who are doing contextual behavioral science, who are present at ABAI. They
Okay.
just might never attend the conference or might not be particularly
Yes, I
involved in
understand.
ACBS.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I actually met you for the first time in Phoenix at that conference, an ABA conference. That was
Yes.
my first one. Uh, Funnily enough, I think you're the only person I didn't really talk to that was on my sort of list of people would be interesting to interact with. There was a lot of people because at that time there were a lot of ACT and RFT people at the conference,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
I was there to present a paper with Louise McHugh and Roger Villadaga and all. So I met with a lot of people, Steve and Jen and the crew from UK and everybody. And so you were around and all, but I don't know if it's because at some point I was exhausted talking to a lot of people and it just happened. I think I was a little bit intimidated too. I think perhaps just like your personality or something like that, just so I could see.
Yeah.
I don't know. But it's funny because after that we had the opportunity to chat at the conference in Holland.
Mhm.
You remember with Jean-Louis also from France.
Mm.
And actually, I always felt like it was really cool to talk with you. I learned that you spoke French, that you have actually French origins. Is that what
Yeah,
you do?
so two ways. On my dad's side, French via Canada, so
Yeah,
via Acadie,
yeah,
and they were deported in the Great
yeah.
Deportation of the Acadian people. And then on my mom's side, my grandfather was French from France. So in
All right.
Louisiana, we
Yeah,
always differentiate French from France
yep,
versus
yep.
French from Acadie. So I'm both Cajun French and French
Yeah.
French.
And the names are a bit different. I can tell when even
Mhm.
comes from a particular area of France, and then you went through Canada. And when you visit people in Quebec, they often have those kind of names, like those
Yeah.
names in EAU, even
Yep.
X sometimes.
Yep.
When I see a name like that, I'm like, yeah. Also, the names like Landry,
Uh-huh.
Landry. That's also, but that's I think it's from a different region in France, more like Southwest, if I'm correct.
Mm.
anyways, so more and more connection. I ended up working in your
Mm,
department for a couple of years.
awesome.
And yeah, always a pleasure. I do feel like I also share something about this attachment to the behavioral roots.
Hmm.
And I'm very curious to hear you. That would be my first question. Um, if you could go back a little bit in time when you discovered behaviorism,
Mm,
what was you know for me in back in France and with my peers and some mentors, we always talk about how it was a game changer. It changed
hmm.
something. Sometimes it's like, oh, it's exactly what I was looking for. Actually, it makes perfect sense. For others, it's more of a revolution, a change of
Hmm.
paradigm.
Mm,
But for a lot of people, there's something really that feels like kind of the movie The Matrix, something like
yeah.
that. Like this. Oh wow, yes, I see something. It's very important, and I want to share it with the world and all. It's not just in
Mm,
behaviorism, of course, but in psychology, I don't know if there are a lot of approaches that have that kind of impact on people. So I'd be curious to hear
mm.
what your experience was in this regard.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of multi-layered. My first sort of glimpse of behaviorism was via a student of Mike Dewar's,
Mhm.
Dave Greenway, who you also know, a
Mhm.
colleague of ours, Dave Greenway. And Dave's since passed, but when I was an undergraduate, actually here at UL, so I've returned as
Yeah.
a faculty member to
Mhm.
the place that I studied as an undergraduate. And as an undergraduate, Dave was sort of our resident behaviorist. And like I think many traditional behaviorists, he was dismissive of the rest of psychology.
Yeah, 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 you're
He
right.
was
I've
really,
experienced that too.
this is the only way that it makes sense to
Yeah.
to look at anything. He talked a lot about ontological assumptions. He talked a lot about just the practicality of behaviorism. And I kind of thought it was bullshit. I'll
Yeah.
be
Hmm.
honest.
Okay.
I felt like he was sucking the soul out of everything.
Hmm.
So he would say things like, I mean, what is love? We can define love
Hmm.
behaviorally, and
Hmm. Hmm.
it felt like something fell off, like
Yeah.
something was missing there. So I resisted for a long time. I think he sort of picked me out as like a hard worker and like somebody who was interested in learning, and so he really wanted to like convert me.
Yeah.
And I was rejecting. I was not interested.
Okay.
And then two things
It was
happened.
lacking life or
So
something like that.
one, he's
Sorry, I think we have a
say
slight.
again.
I think we have a slight delay. I'll try not to interrupt you too much, but
Uh-oh.
um, it was lacking life or something like that. It didn't feel meaningful enough. That behavioral interpretation, like you say,
Yeah.
like love, for example.
Yeah, I think it felt like it lacked something, like something was missing when we used a behavioral orientation. I think it was actually had to more to do with Dave's fluency with it in retrospect, and with his sort of insistence on letting go of certain constructs. So he's sort of like, you don't need that, you don't need that, you don't need that. You can just look at it this way, as opposed to they're pointing to something. I mean, there's something there, in this term of love or in this term of defense mechanism or in this term of attachment style. Like there is some sort of orderly thing that people are pointing to. What might they be pointing to? That wasn't really Dave's style. Dave's more like, you don't need to talk about attachment style. You could just talk about, interpersonal repertoires and patterns of reinforcement. So for me, it was subtractive. Like it was sort of trying to boil everything down. And I
Okay.
was young. I mean, I was probably, 20 at this time. Um, so yeah, so two things happened. One is he's a clever guy and he helped me find a job. And I was a single mom and I needed money. And so he hooked me up with Meeta Patel. Meeta Patel was a UNR PhD in behavior analysis. And she was taking clients in Louisiana, children with autism, and running ABA programs, ABA home programs. And so I had my first client. I was what we would call now an RBT, like a registered behavior therapist or a line tech. It was just my job. And the child, our client, was the same age as my oldest, Han, at the time, my only child. And first, I was stunned by the differences in their repertoires. They were probably four, and you've met my Han, my oldest child, and they're quite verbal, quite sort of ebullient, very social. And this kid did not look when I entered the room, had zero interest in, me. I'm there interviewing, and I was struck by that. And then Meta handed me this technology and this way to watch this repertoire just explode out of
Mhm.
this child. She was just starting the program. So I was there right at the beginning, and it was amazing. It was incredibly gratifying work. It was incredibly humbling work. And for me, Matt, it was like I could not only see that his repertoire was getting bigger, like he was learning new things, which of course I had seen in my own child, but it was so marked because his world was expanding.
Mhm.
It was like with
Mhm.
every new behavior, there was this new thing that might not have even been there before, or might have been super aversive before, right? That it was like too loud or too rough or just foreign and scary. So I was watching his repertoire explode and watching his world explode, and I was wow. I mean, it was not like waiting tables. It was really,
Mhm. Mhm.
really felt meaningful. Um, the thing is, though, I kind of thought that it was about limited repertoires. Like, I didn't really understand how it would link to phenomena like love or freedom or,
Mhm.
philosophy or creativity or, and then another of our shared colleagues, Dr. Rick Perkins. Rick gave me the Acceptance and Commitment Therapy 1999 book. And he said, well, this is behaviorism too.
Mhm. Mhm.
Sort of
Mhm.
telling him like, get Dave off my back.
Mhm.
Yeah, this works. I mean, I love working with this client, but what does this have to do with therapy?
Yeah.
Which is what I thought my main job would be. And he said, well, and he just kind of slid the book across the desk, check this out. Very different styles, those two mentors.
Yeah.
And I open the book, and the first line is something like the single most surprising or single most significant thing about human existence is how hard it is to be happy,
Yeah.
something like that. And oh yeah, I was like, this is what I'm talking about. And the next thing that it then presented me with is how do I put these two behaviorisms together? Like,
Okay.
what is the thing that bridges these? What is the thing
Mhm.
that makes this incredible work that I'm doing with this kid, helping to expand his repertoire, his world, his relationships? How is that the same thing as this,
Yeah.
all of these very relatable struggles that I was reading about in the ACTS
Mhm.
book? And yeah, I think that was sort of the start. I'll pause there.
Did you experience any, I guess, gap or discrepancy, something that felt like, how can I um, reconcile my current worldview, my way of thinking
Mm,
about the world, myself, the way things work? Like, I give you a couple of examples.
yeah.
Determinism was always a big one in
Mm,
our classes. When we start talking about free will, determinism, the role of context, history. For those who were used to thinking really like free will, it was challenging,
mm,
and sometimes a big revolution. Sometimes it would reject it, go back and forth. Um, for others, it could be the monistic view of the world, this sort of
mm.
sense of, well, in the end, all is behavior, and so how do you conceptualize like what a thought is, or
Mm.
spiritualities that belong to were there things like that you experienced as in your journey with behaviorism, whether it was through ABA or ACT?
Yeah, I don't think so, honestly. I mean, I'm looking back, so it's hard to know. But from this
Mhm.
perspective, from where I sit now, I think of two things. One is that I wasn't really satisfied in psychology.
Mm,
My experience in my undergraduate psychology education, and of course, by this time I was later on, I was a senior, or maybe even working on my master's, um, and I kept waiting for the big reveal of what
mhm,
made personality psychology the same discipline as physiological psychology, and that the same
mhm,
discipline as social, and the same discipline as my learning class, my cognitive class. I mean, it felt like this it's totally disparate. It felt like no class had anything to do with any of the other classes. It was all just all of these different perspectives, and everybody was right, and everybody had data. And I actually found that really off-putting. I kept
yeah,
waiting for like the senior class that made it all make sense, that allowed me to bring terms from social to bear in the personality literature, terms from personality to bear in physio. It just, I really felt dissatisfied. In fact, at one point, I changed my major to pre-med and started taking
yeah,
chemistry classes
okay,
because
yeah,
I just wanted something orderly that I could put my hands around. And when I realized that you couldn't even predict the behavior of an electron, I was like, oh, well, I'll go back to
mm,
psychology.
yeah, yeah,
But so that there was that. It was behaviorism came in and was that. It was like all of a sudden I could go, well, I can understand all these social psychology phenomena. I can understand
yeah,
obedience, or conformity from a behavioral perspective. I can understand brain chemistry from a behavioral perspective. I can understand all of these things, or try to understand, all
mhm,
of these things through this lens. And it was unifying for me. It
yeah,
felt like a unifying perspective. I think I think too, another important thing that comes to mind is for me, I think that my family sort of had a contextual perspective, even if it wasn't articulated
mhm,
as
mhm,
such. I think about like I would complain about people, usually
mhm,
people in charge of me. So people that told me what to do. And I would sort of, complain about them. This teacher
mhm,
is,
mhm,
she yells at us or whatever it is. And my mom would always say like things like, "Oh, baby, that's just their limitations.
mhm,
Like they're just limited, or things like how do you think she learned that? Or things like if I was, really upset, things like, well, she's causing you this much upset. Can you imagine? She can't ever leave her own experience. She has to deal with that all the time. It was this sort of, compassionate,
yeah.
of course, people are where they are and are the only place that they could be. That for me, I felt like gave a little science behind
Yeah.
that sort of compassionate stance.
It sounds to me that it characterizes the culture of, I was going to say Louisiana, but maybe even more specifically the
Mhm.
Cajun area, that sense of community and compassion. And I remember when we were there, that's something that really struck us, and I may have talked about it together at that time, but there's I don't know if I would go as far as saying non-judgmental, because that's probably doesn't happen in any human community, really. But uh, really, that sense of taking into account the context, the history,
Yeah,
and giving a chance also, the sense of forgiveness too. Perhaps it's perhaps the
I
biggest
think
one,
so.
right? There's like people can change, people can come back. The people are complex, and I'm thinking that the culture, the roots you mentioned it. There's a lot of richness. I remember the students I had there. They all looked so different. They all had different
Mhm.
accents, even if they had
Mhm.
were all born in Lafayette, had been there for a generation. They all had different accents. That was really incredible. So yeah, you would see, you mentioned your family, but you would say that maybe you would expand that even to the cultural context.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective. I think it's right. I mean, I think people are, even if they're not aware of the facts, I think people are very aware, just in general, of the relationship between circumstances and behavior. Choices I think people see people's choices in the context of their circumstances.
Mhm.
The first practicum that I did, like a clinical practicum in undergrad, I wasn't actually doing anything. I was sort of shadowing, and I sat down with the head nurse, and she said to me that the most important thing for me to remember about being on this inpatient unit was that all of us could be here as
Yeah.
patients,
Yeah.
any of us, that it just wouldn't take that much, that
Hmm.
that a tiny shift in circumstances
Hmm.
could put us in the position where we were the ones without the
Yeah.
badge to
Yeah.
scan in and out. And it struck me at that moment, but also it felt, yeah, it felt like part of what was in the air in
Hmm.
the culture
Hmm.
here is just
Yeah.
this expectation that people are gonna people are gonna do what, well, I would say now people are gonna do what they're resourced to do. People are
Hmm.
gonna do what their situation allows for them to do. And it is hopeful.
Yeah.
Like it's not just about forgiveness, it's also about yeah, about teaching, about
Yeah.
being able to grow people and
Yeah.
yeah, nurture them.
But related to this point, you mentioned earlier that you were impressed by the functional potential of it. You could see
Mhm.
that you can do something, that you can help, and people can grow, and I think that's something that attracts people to behaviorism a lot in psychology, especially when they compare it to approaches that might be less, at least not immediately obviously useful, and like you can
Yeah.
do something with it. There is something very attractive when you see, when you understand even the basic principles of operant conditioning in classes. Often you can see, and I love to teach those classes again and again and again and again. I know my supervisor was the same. He would teach the same class every year, but just enjoy it because you see people really discover something that is interesting but also useful. It feels, it reminds me of almost like superhero stories when the hero discovers their power. It's like, oh, I can do that, or
Mm.
but precisely similar to the stories, there is a dark side to it too. It's like, oh, you can get enamored with that power. You can become arrogant. You can feel like there's a sort of
Mm.
god syndrome there, where both in terms of how much you think you can control and want to control, but also what you were saying earlier, perhaps the way David Greenway was talking about behaviorism, like this sense of sort of omniscience, like I know everything, I can understand everything, I can analyze everything. Did you have phases like that, or
Mm.
have you had that experience of in your interactions with the behavioral community? Of people being like that, and that's being a struggle for you, or can you speak a bit about that?
Yeah, there's sort of I think two positions. One is I was very once I sort of connected with behaviorism and especially contextual behaviorism, I was in. That was it. And that translation was such an awesome like brain tickle for me. So
Hmm.
being able to sit in any class and be translating and translating and translating and being able to use my reflections that are, reflection assignments as an opportunity to say, well, when I think about this as a behaviorist, as a contextual behaviorist, this is how I look at it. And this would be a cool experiment that would come out of it. It made every class interesting to me in my doc
Hmm.
program. It did not make all of my comments interesting to my professors.
Yeah, I can relate to that.
So there were some, I was telling a student yesterday, I was kind of actually kind of trauma dumping on her a little bit, but she was saying, like, did you ever feel alienated from your
Mm.
peers in your clinical program? And I was sharing that there was this one professor that called me out in class. I had kind of like, I was trying not to talk too much because I
Hmm.
talk a lot. So I'm trying to be mindful, try not to talk too much. And she said, well, Emily, you had some interesting comments on your reflections that you turned in. And I sort of, I mean, I wasn't sure. I didn't think that she would have like really liked my comments that much. They seemed kind of apropos of nothing considering what we were talking about. She
Mm.
said, well, your perspective was really different. And so I thought, oh, okay. So I shared some, and I don't even remember, but it was something like, well, all behaviors learned. So, I mean, this is learned behavior, which
Hmm.
means we could
Hmm.
intervene on it. And she sort of opened it up to the class, like, what does the class think? And they were all kind of like, well, that's Emily's perspective. Of course, that would be Emily's
Mm.
perspective. They were sort of not sort of particularly ruffled by it. But then she kind of leaned in on me. She was like, so do you think your perspective is the right perspective? I was, "Well, no, I
Hmm.
mean, but it's useful, more useful than other perspectives. And I'm the student.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, for some of the things that I'm trying to do, but like everybody gets to have their own goals and think about their perspectives and evaluate them according to their own goals, good functional contextualists. And she just held me to it. Well, it certainly seems like you think your opinion is better than other people's. Well, it's not my opinion.
Hmm.
It's a perspective that you take on. And I was just sort of baffled and getting more and more anxious until the point that I burst into tears. And I'm sitting there crying, and she says, "Well, I'm not sure why you're becoming hysterical. Let's take a break so Emily can get herself together." And I'm sort of, I left. I just said, "This is not appropriate. This is not an appropriate interaction. I'm not learning anything, and I don't think anybody else is. I'm gonna dip." And I left class for the rest of the day. I came back the next time, and I just didn't say anything for the rest of the semester, pretty much. But I really. I asked myself in retrospect, like, was it one of those moments where younger Emily was just like so
Ah.
excited and so ready to share and so like, this is interesting, right? And thinking like, I can be big and excited in a way that invites you to be big and
Hmm.
excited,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
like, is it reading that that's not the case, or was just this a really mean professor who,
Yeah.
was not entertained and not interested? And I don't know. I mean, I also had, my mentor's reputation to work with, which sometimes was an
Hmm.
advantage and
Hmm.
sometimes was not an advantage. My mentor being Kelly, he was
Yeah.
of course her colleague. So there were times I think where I was so enjoying building this skill of translating everything into behavior analysis without necessarily building the skill of honoring the perspective
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
which the terms came from, from which the terms came, or from which those constructs were introduced,
Hmm.
or the research was designed, like without saying like that's a cool perspective and maybe this is where that might have come from, not extending that understanding of maybe a more mentalist perspective, not extending the behavioral account
Hmm.
of how
Hmm.
one might end up a mentalist. Have you heard the joke, how do you turn a behaviorist into a mentalist?
I think so, maybe. I don't remember the answer
The
to the
project.
question.
You ask them to explain the behavior of a mentalist.
Oh, yeah.
And then we start saying, like,
Yeah.
oh, they just don't understand.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's a good
Uh,
one. Yeah.
they
That's
could,
because
they
they don't really want to. They, yeah, yeah, yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah,
You
and,
know,
and and it could probably work with the psychoanalysts too, like well, they have defenses and their resistance to really to
right,
seeing the truth.
right.
Yeah, 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 yeah. That
Yeah.
it is quite interesting. I see the similarities with my own experience. I've wondered, that's something I used to talk about with my supervisor back then, because he was definitely ostracized, although could also say ostracize himself, alienate himself. I think behaviors have often a responsibility in their, when you were sharing your experience, but as a student, but even as more advanced senior academics and all the, I think there is something that often behaviorists enjoy about being alone against the world or in a small group of minorities
Mm,
speaking up. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's just something to be um, cautious about because it
yeah.
can make us very righteous and enjoy the battle more than
Mm.
the cause it. And so sometimes you're always looking for the next thing to fight about because that's
Mhm.
what actually is reinforcing. Uh,
Yeah.
what has been really transformative for me, and it didn't happen in one day, it was progressive, but it's the discovery and understanding of a-ontology.
Mm,
Because the way I was trained, I think, was all fine as a behaviorist to fit well with functional contextualism. But the one element that was not part of my training in terms of philosophy was the ontological part. Uh,
mm,
it was and I've talked with my supervisor about it recently, so I know it was not just my understanding, my interpretation. His
Hmm.
stance is pretty ontological.
Yeah.
And as a result, I think it's almost like we could say the same things in terms of behavioral principles, but I thought that was the truth, the truth, intrinsic truth. It's not about
Yeah.
a way of approaching the world, a way of conceptualizing the world that's useful. It was, no, it's not. It's like when you talk with a client and they say something and you reflect back and say, so you're thinking that it's not a thought, it's truth. It's like, okay, that's fair enough, but that shows that level of attachments there. Um, did you have what was I guess what was your discovery like of a-ontology? Was that also like a sort
Hmm.
of flowing, or was that
Hmm.
more a struggle when you reflect on this concept? And perhaps also you could say a little bit about your understanding of this concept, because what I found is that when you start talking about it, even inside your community, you realize that maybe not everybody's understanding it the same way. So I'm kind of curious
Yeah.
to hear you talk about that.
I have a super expansive, I think, appreciation of a-ontology as a stance, because I have always been bad at believing as a
Hmm.
repertoire. Like if we think of believing as behavior, not thinking, not knowing, not assuming, but like
Hmm.
believing, there's a thing that we're naming there that it's like I don't have the stuff to do it. I think about like my religious education. I was raised Catholic,
Hmm.
and in my religious education, I would sort of probe, and what I would find is that there was this thing that was being asked of me to believe,
Yeah.
that you just have faith. And I didn't understand what people were talking
Hmm.
about.
Hmm.
Like this was this long standing, I think, kind of almost crisis for me
Yeah.
throughout my life, that I didn't feel like I understood what people meant when they said like they really believed something,
Hmm.
right? Um, and so the my introduction to, I think, a-ontology came in a couple of different bites. The first time that I attended ABAI, I just went down this really big rabbit hole. Like I had always been taught, of course, it's only a reinforcer with respect to this one behavior, and it's only a conditioned stimulus with respect to this one behavior. But I think it was Steve talking, or one of his students, that really got me to sort of start to see stimulating and responding as one thing. And I relate this to a-ontology in a couple of ways, but as I started to experience stimulating and responding as one thing, it drove me completely mad. I started to like, well, that how come we don't just talk about like stimulus relating? Like how come we don't have one term, and that means this, and that means this, and that means this. And in my ambition or brashness or insensitivity to social norms, I wrote Stephen Hayes an email and said,
Hmm.
how come we would even distinguish stimulating from responding? Why would we even do that? Like that doesn't even
Hmm.
make any
Hmm.
sense. If they are of a kind, if every
Yeah.
time you're responding, like it's stimuli are
Yeah.
changing, and every
Yeah.
time stimuli are changing, you respond. It was so distressing to me. I just felt
Hmm.
like,
Hmm.
guys, we've been wrong about
Hmm.
this.
Hmm.
And he actually wrote back, and I think sensitive to my culture, he said, it's kind of like the Trinity in Catholicism.
Hmm.
And it worked as a metaphor. He said, it's we peel them apart, not because they are separate in any way. In fact, I think you're right in describing them as unitary, as sort of one thing. He said, but we peel them apart not as an ontological strategy, but as this sort of pragmatic strategy,
Hmm.
because it is useful, because the thing that we are interested in doing is intervening, so being stimuli for
Yeah.
behavior, so that we can change behavior. And he wrote me this very generous email. I once
Okay.
heard Steve say he spends 4 hours a day on email, so I believe it, because it's just this random person emailing him. Um, And what that gave me permission to do, I think, is let go of the idea that the labels that we put on things have to correspond to some reality in the world. Like this idea that we could sort of practically apply labels was brand new for me.
Mm.
It really, I found it very, very freeing. And so that was a little glimpse of this. It made a lot of things that Dave Greenway was saying about ontological assumptions and constructs, which he was just using to kind of attack the rest of psychology. It
Yeah.
sort of brought that same perspective to behavior analysis and these behavioral terms that I knew were useful because I was watching this kid's repertoire grow, right?
Hmm.
And and then I got the great fortune of studying with Kelly Wilson in my doctoral program, and the whole front end of our learning class, like 6 weeks, we spent on philosophical readings.
Yeah.
And so we walked through Pepper and we walked through, logical positivism and sort of
Mhm.
deconstructing that. We walked through just what it means for something to be true. And one of my colleagues lost his belief in God. I didn't lose the belief in God. I just lost
Hmm. Hmm.
the urge to believe, or I got permission to just go, oh, I don't believe. I just
Yeah, I
don't.
see.
I swore off belief a
Yeah.
long time ago. And so it has implications in my life, I think, really super broadly, because, if I'm trying to figure out if somebody's a nice guy or not, that's not about like what do I believe about this person? It's like how am I going to effectively interact with them? Or
I see.
if I'm
Okay.
trying to figure out
Okay.
if I believe in God or understand somebody else's belief in God, I don't really have to look at it through the lens of belief at all.
Mm.
I can look at it in terms of what is the repertoire that this affords, that
Yeah.
this interaction with the world affords, and is it useful? Does it free me
Yeah.
up? And yeah, it's a really radical, I think for me, radical, not in the terms of like really extreme, but radical in terms of foundational. It's a
Sure.
really foundational, stance for me, the
Um,
ontology.
um, on the other side of that, I guess, useful positive take that is pragmatic and look at what
Mm,
you can do with it. If you're ontological, it becomes practical. On the other side of it is the risk of relativism and losing meaning, right? Like if you
mm,
and that's something that we see a lot in therapy, but even just in society too, is that as you gain that flexibility, because it could be this, it could be that, it could have the
yeah.
identity, another identity, it's what's useful and all. But what comes with it often is a loss of meaning, a loss of
Mm,
coherence, a loss of integrity,
yeah.
purpose, and all those words. So how do you deal with that? Like you say, well, I don't believe, or I didn't need to believe. And how do you manage to have a sense of purpose, that to find life meaningful? What's the because in a way, well, it's an old thing that we keep talking about in the community, but it's the reason why we keep talking about it is because it's not maybe it doesn't have a final resolution. We can say, oh, because it's useful. Okay, but useful for what? And then you have to go
Yeah.
back to the question. Well, how do you approach this issue?
Yeah. Oh man, there's so many that question I think resonates with so many parts of my history and so
Uh-huh.
many sort of cultural traditions that have become part of my way of sort of approaching and understanding the world. So the one that I think is showing up this sort of strongest is this idea that this shows up in Buddhism. I'm not going to use the right like technical terms or whatever, the right jargon, but there's this same thing that happens in Buddhism. Like if you start to let go of the distinction between all things, and let things sort of melt into each other, and let everything that ever was be one with everything that ever will be, and you sort of allow yourself to tolerate, I think, and contact, the unitary nature of all events, and to let yourself also melt into that, and to really, I mean, even if it's just for a moment, to sort of really contact that. For many people, I think it's quite disturbing, and
Hmm.
there's almost like a crisis. And so, what goes with that, what that can, I think, with the right support, what that can actually foster and open up room for is this sort of endless compassion for all things. This sort of, if everything is everything, then, that frees you up to sort of
Yeah.
love everything and choose what
Hmm.
that's going to look like.
Absolutely.
I don't believe in choice as like, I don't believe in, I don't have a sense that like, you know, that free choice as people mean it, is like a thing that I believe in. I mean, I've already told you I don't really believe in anything, but but the experience of freedom is really, really important. And I think it depends on when you make contact with that sort of, relativism, or that sort of like there are no true labels, or there is no capital T truth. As you make contact with that, I think it depends on how well resourced you are then to select amongst options, and to choose among possibilities, and to
Hmm.
orient to things that are pleasant or delightful. You don't have to sit in appreciation of the all in all moments. Like, you could sit in appreciation of this ant walking across
Hmm.
this petal
Hmm.
of a
Hmm.
magnolia, a magnolia bloom. And that might be your contact with the all. It
Yeah.
might be that, like, allowing yourself to sort of sink into this ant in this moment right now
Yeah.
is your contact with everything that ever was and everything that ever will
Yeah.
be. Yeah, is that, did I get
Yeah, I
too?
know it's super interesting. Yeah, very interesting because what I've realized maybe relatively recently is that you can read text and have discussions, and sometimes we say the same thing but we mean something different. Sometimes we say
Mm,
different things but we mean the same thing. So it's even when we have uh, relatively similar background or different history still, but at this point we have a relatively similar history in being part of the same community and all. But still, I can see the some nuances, or I wonder if it's different or not. The way I've been approaching that sense of sort of truth and coherence and purpose that guides you is with while being still grounded in ontology is by thinking, all right, a-ontology is not anti-ontology. It doesn't
mm,
mean I
mhm,
I say there's nothing essential. If I say there is nothing essential,
mm,
I'm taking a stance that is just as essentialist as it's the same thing as being a atheist instead of agnostic. In the end, you
mm,
believe in the non-existence of God. You're still engaging in that way of reifying the phenomenon.
mm,
So I'm approaching values, for example, as this sort of ongoing process where I can surrender to the obvious truth that I'm experiencing. Like now, I
mm,
could deny that. I could say, well, what does it matter what we're doing right now? Like talking, recording
mm,
that thing. Who cares? But at the same time, I can also find myself just enjoying it, coming back to it.
yeah,
I've had periods where I feel like, what's the point? Maybe I should change field. I don't want to do that anymore.
mm,
But then again, I'm interested again in psychology. And
mm,
so there's that sense of it doesn't have to be reified. It doesn't have to be like, well, then I know who I am. I know what I care about. I know
mm,
values, and that's it. And I can just engrave them in stone and follow.
mhm,
That's, I can just say, well, it really seems like I care about that. That to this point, I reflect, I scan my life in time, across space, and all, and like, hey, it seems like I like talking about these things, sharing my knowledge about these things. And that's how I'm finding that sense of coherence, integrity,
mhm.
remaining flexible and open to possible change. Does that fit the way you're thinking about it, or is it different?
Yeah, yeah. And what I love about what you're saying, I feel like, I feel like I can pick up ways that are like bits of your history that I haven't been there for, because
Hmm.
I think you're thinking about it and talking about it differently than maybe the last time we talked about this, and I just want to appreciate that.
Yeah.
Um, there's the part that I'm like really, I think, resonating with is I'm increasingly thinking about the relationship between what we might call like verbal contingencies and verbal functions, and those what that we might call like more direct. I'm increasingly thinking about the direction of those interactions as differently. So I think in ACT, especially when I first started learning RFT, the idea was like all of this verbal stuff overrides the direct stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like more powerful and it
Hmm.
overrides. And so you like pick a value and then you can dig through anything
Hmm.
and you can push through anything. And it was sort of, I mean, and I wonder if maybe just my repertoire is different from the people that developed those theories. Maybe my experience of the world is just very different. Of course it is, but maybe this is a difference that's being named because, for me, when you talk about that, like the really important thing about values might be that sinking into this moment
Hmm.
and appreciating this interaction and watching your own process and even being in a situation that allows you to treat yourself with gentleness and with love and maybe even be interested in your own process in a way that isn't disparaging or evaluative. It's this sort of direct and immediate and acute
Yeah.
contact with what I would call appetitive functional relations,
Hmm.
this kind
Hmm.
of breadth and expansiveness and flexibility. And then to me, it doesn't really matter what words you put around it. If I said,
Hmm.
okay, Matt, so what do you value? How you answer that doesn't really matter that much. And so I think in old ways of talking about like verbal and nonverbal or like, relational or direct contingencies or things like that, like I'm almost coming into a perspective that those direct nonverbal contingencies are what is really, really important, and that the
Yeah.
verbal is derivative from that.
Yeah.
The
I see
verbal
what you
might
mean.
be a way to try to shortcut it in other spots,
Yes.
like,
Yes. Yes.
but also if I shortcut it too much, I lose presence and I lose
Hmm.
connection and I
Hmm.
lose intentionality and maybe lose contact with myself, that like bit of self-awareness and self-regard that's threaded through this.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think what you're saying really, really resonates for me. And it's almost like a bottom up instead of top down.
Yeah. Yeah. I see what you mean. It's the distinction, verbal contingencies or symbolic contingencies, language, and direct contingencies, or we call it different ways. In fact, we always struggle to find the right term because
Yeah.
kind of like what you were saying earlier about distinguishing stimulating and responding, you can't really find a line that separates them
Yeah.
completely. It is always a, well, but what does that really mean? And perhaps we've emphasized a little too much the distinction because we're trying to point to certain functions
Hmm.
that potential that's expands in terms of creating functions and yeah, I can feel like at some point it's disconnected or arbitrary, as we like to call it sometimes. But is it really? Is it not just like more of an expansion of the same thing? I like, for example, to think of values as symbolic elaborations of basic needs. In the
Hmm.
end, I think you can come up with lists and less lists of values, but you can also see patterns, connections,
100%.
and going back to what basic needs of exploration, autonomy, connection, and three or
Yeah.
four or two, depending on the system that you use. But I like that sort of way of thinking because then, like you said, well, you could think of values as shortcuts. You could also look at them as elaborations, much more complex, and go directly with
Mm-hmm.
basic needs. Like some therapies do that. They go more with the biological need, but
Hmm.
but in the end, what is important to me is to approach the whole process as in a holistic way. It's like for some therapists really like to work on the physical sensations, body, the way the body works. I'm like fine with that, but don't dichotomize the self with like body versus mind. Like, oh, your mind is chattering, you're too much in your head.
Hmm.
Well, it's part of it. If you're cognitive
Hmm.
psychologist, fine, but how is it anchored in your physical sensation so that you can really have that monistic
Yeah.
take? Do you also, is that something like you that makes sense to you also, this
Yeah.
sense of being holistic?
Yeah, I think you can hear it in the way that you ask certain questions. If we're thinking about like the therapist's, invitations to notice, for example, I will ask about people's minds, but the way that I ask it might be like, tell me what your mind's doing, as your body tenses up like
Yes,
that,
yes, yes, yes.
or what thoughts are coming with this, or,
Yeah.
are you imagining right now? I feel like I can see you imagining something, or,
Hmm, hmm.
so I will ask, what are you remembering? And then my next question might be, what feelings come with that memory?
Yes,
And can
come
you
with
feel that in
that,
your
right? Like
body?
that
Exactly.
coordination. Yeah, yeah,
Exactly. The metaphor in interbehaviorism is, of course, the behavioral stream.
yeah.
And I love it because it describes this unfolding
Hmm,
dynamic
hmm.
nature of behavior. I also love it because it's unitary. Every activity of the integrated organism is one stream, is part of that one stream. But it also allows us to imagine currents within the stream.
Hmm.
So you could imagine, a cognitive current
Yeah,
and a
yeah.
physiological or hormonal current or whatever. Um, and just like in a regular body of water, some currents may sort of go really closely together
Hmm.
sometimes, and some may be moving more
Yeah.
independently. And then things might shift, the world around it might shift, and some currents might distinguish themselves
I
and
like
kind
the
of go their
metaphor.
own way.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I love this thing that you're pointing to of that, like I said, that unitary, or like you said, that sort of one holistic,
Yeah.
and I would say that one holistic behavioral stream, a unitary stream of behavior, that we are inviting people. I mean, I think one of our main jobs is inviting people to notice, to be aware of this sort of flow of behavior that is their process, that is, ongoing and intimately responsive to the world around them, to the point to be, to the point that it's unitary, that,
Yes.
there is no context, there's no behavior that does not change context. It's the whole reason that we behave.
Hmm, hmm, hmm,
We
hmm,
that's why living things have behaviors,
hmm,
in order
hmm.
to change their contact with the things outside of the behavioral stream. And there is no, context. We wouldn't call it context unless it changed behavior.
Yes.
So that sort of intimate interaction. So I want people to be able to attend to their process, but attend to their process in context. Most importantly, like attend to that functional relationship between this unfolding behavioral stream
Hmm,
and this unfolding world around it. And of course, I don't say really any of those words to them. What I say
hmm.
is, what's happening right now in your body as you tell me that, or
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, but
um,
it's important because the functions are there.
yeah.
The,
Even the as you tell me that,
yeah,
or
exactly. I
what
mean,
comes with that. Yeah.
the words can be incredibly basic. If silence can be very basic, but
Yeah.
the functions that are, it feels almost magical, it's like, well,
Mm.
but how could that be different whether I having that intention or not, if in the end I'm just asking how you feeling now? Well, it's yeah, it's almost magical, but I often say, well, don't forget that there are a lot of things that come with it. It's the your facial expression, your tone of voice, the pace, what you're going to say before, after, how you're going, what you're going to pay attention to in the response. All that is part of what's going to be expressed. So you might say, "Hey, how are you doing today?" But depending on where what you're trying to
Hmm.
do, or even if you care or not, that's it's going to make a big difference. Um, you've brought up so a couple of concepts and ideas that touch on things that I want to talk about today, and so I'm excited about that, and I'm not surprised too because I know that it's things that have been of interest to you. You mentioned interbehaviorism. You also mentioned this whole process of noticing. So all these things are connected in my mind right now, and
Mm.
I'm wondering where I want to start. I think probably it would make more sense, especially for people who are listening and less aware of the what interbehaviorism is. Perhaps to ask you to I know it could be a big task, but I think you're pretty good at this kind of task. Could you explain what interbehaviorism is? What your understanding
Yeah.
is? And my understanding is that it's not your original background, but it's something that
Mhm.
has become of greater interest to you, like for other people in the community. So can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. So it was sort of secretly in my background without me knowing and without it being named. I'll just say real quick for folks who have had parts of their history that correspond to mine. I was sort of taught interbehaviorism goes under descriptive
Yep.
contextualism, and descriptive contextualism isn't practical. So you don't really need to worry about that. Everything useful about interbehaviorism was integrated into contextual behaviorism and full stop. So, I knew that my colleague Kate Kellum, who was one of the lab leads in my lab at Ole Miss and is now a dear friend, I knew that Kelly, both of them had studied with Linda Hayes, who was Jacob Cantor, who founded Inter-behaviorism, who was his student. But it was sort of, offered to me as we don't have to worry about that. It was sort of dismissed, I think, in
Mm-hmm.
my history. And I think that that was a mistake. I don't think it was my mistake, at least not initially. I think it was a mistake because there are these really important ideas that are actually centered in interbehaviorism in a way that's foundational to the theory. Um, Linda recounts that Jacob Cantor approached Fred Skinner and said, "Hey, we should, like, I've got the philosophy, interbehaviorism, and you've got radical behaviorism. Interbehaviorism is the philosophical foundation of your work. We should work together." They were sort of at the same university for, I think, just a couple years.
Mm-hmm.
And Skinner said radical behaviorism was a philosophy of science. He
Mm.
did not need interbehaviorism, and he rejected the invitation to collaborate. And so the two
Interesting.
sort of, yeah, persisted independently. And certainly behaviorism, radical behaviorism became the more dominant
Mm-hmm.
perspective in the
Mm-hmm.
field. Um, so interbehaviorism, and if people have heard of the term interbehavior, it sort of centers on the study of interbehavior, or the term psychological event is mostly synonymous with interbehavior. Interbehaviorism is the philosophy of science underlying, really, we could say all of science potentially. I mean, it could be applied to chemistry or sociology or, physics, just like it could be applied to psychology. Interbehavioral psychology is the application of interbehaviorism to the study of
Yeah.
what we would call interbehavior. And I mention that because we could think of the interbehavior of atoms. We could think of the interbehavior of
Mm-hmm.
objects in space, or the interbehavior of quanta, or we could think of the interbehavior of societies, at a sort of political science, level. It hasn't been, as far as I know, sort of trotted out, or applied with the same level of completeness as it has in psychology. But I feel strongly about that potential, and Jacob Cantor offered that as a whole system of thought, a way of approaching science. I won't stay too long there because I think the application to psychology would be what's most interesting from an interbehavioral perspective. Then the study of psychology isn't the study of behavior; it's the study of interbehavior.
Yeah.
And that is pointing to the idea that we kind of started with, the idea that stimulating and responding can never be different or can never be separated. At the heart of the formula for a psychological event or an interbehavioral field is the idea of stimulus and response functions, and they are one. They're symbolized with a double-headed arrow.
Yeah.
It's that idea that, everything that we are doing is changing the stimulating, and everything that is stimulating
Yeah.
is changing the responding. And that sort of ongoing dynamic functional relation is really what we are studying there. The
Yeah.
unit of analysis is that functional relationship. It is, those that functional relationship, and learning then is not a change in behavior. It's a change in functional
Yeah.
relationships.
Yeah.
There's other elements of the psychological event. So they talk about medium of contact, right? The idea that context and behavior are interfacing in some sort of way, or stimulating and responding, or interfacing, and that is constantly shifting. If I close
Mhm.
my eyes, if I have a cold, right? These different aspects of the organism, sort of organismic variables, could change the medium of contact. The organism is a factor in the interbehavioral field. It also takes history, like that idea of learning history, talks about an interbehavioral history, and the
Mhm.
idea that interbehavioral history is only accessible and is only present in the present. It
Yeah.
is only a thing in the present. So in every interaction between context and behavior, it contains all previous iterations of interactions
Yes.
between context and
Yeah.
behavior. The word that I offer, that I think I'm warming Linda and Mitch on, is a concept from physics called convolution.
Yeah.
And so when things convolve, it means they co-evolve.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. So if you think of the interaction between context and behavior, these sort of indistinguishable events as evolving in conjunction with one another, co-varying, but in an orderly way, such that that functional relationship is evolving, then we could think about when we distinguish them into context and behavior for practical reasons, we could think of that change as convolution, that
Would
what
you
learning is convolution. Mhm.
would you say then that you maybe we're approaching the process a little more through correlation and less through causation,
Oh,
maybe?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that I mean, from an interbehavioral perspective, I think you would sort of scoff at the idea of causes at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because, where do we sort of stop the
Yes.
analysis and
Yes.
say,
Yeah.
like, this is the
Well,
cause?
that's where Steve will usually say, I think my understanding, his take, I won't speak for him, but we have to start somewhere and
Yeah.
we have to be pragmatic. And because if we
Yeah.
keep going, then it's endless, and then we're not going to do anything with it, right?
Yeah.
That rejection of interbehaviorism comes from the idea that we're not going to be able to do anything with it. I think
Yeah.
it's misunderstanding, and I kind of like you. I was maybe secretly interbehaviorist, but not really because I was not really introduced to behaviorism. So it was more like I think Dermot Barnes said similar things recently. Also, is that well, maybe I was an interbehaviorist without realizing it.
Yeah.
I kind of feel that way, although it's kind of easy to rewrite history, including your own history. But I think that's very okay. So, what we call pragmatic stance, I think it's also sometimes a little bit inaccurate or misunderstood. There is the pragmatism that's pretty much a synonym for utilitarianism or
Mhm.
let's do what works. And then there's the pragmatism, which I think honestly is the true pragmatism. I mean, I know there are varieties of pragmatism and all, but which is holistic, which is has that dimension of, yeah, you cannot start somewhere and end somewhere. It's about embracing the whole experience. It goes back to what I
Yeah.
was saying earlier. I cannot say this is the cause of, this is the end of, but it can still be pragmatic. Can you? So I don't interrupt you in your presentation of interbehaviorism, but precisely because everything connects and you can never really stop and start somewhere. But can you speak about that? How is it functional? Because like you say, it's often called descriptive, but I don't think it's a problem that it's called descriptive personally. Of course, if interbehaviorists don't like this term, it's fair enough. But I don't necessarily see it as a negative
Mm.
term. But what I'm interested in is how you relate that to the functionality of it. And I would
Yeah.
make a parallel if you can hold all those thoughts. I can repeat later. But uh, in application, you were talking earlier about noticing and the importance of noticing.
Mm.
It is a behavior, like you said.
Yeah.
It is a transformation of the context too. Even if we
100%.
said, oh, it's just about describing, it's just about noticing, even if I was the case, it's not nothing.
Yeah,
So what do you think?
100%. Yeah, 100%. I have a number of reactions. One is I think anybody that hears sort of the way that we're talking about the unitary nature of events and watching those distinctions sort of fall away and attending to the functional relations that are constantly changing. I think anybody that hears that and says, well, there's nothing to do there,
Yeah.
I just sort of feel sad for them. what are you trying to do? Like you could do whatever. It's the same thing we were talking about before. Like, well, well, then nothing matters.
Yeah,
Well, I
yeah,
don't know. I mean, why are you landing there? Like, I don't know. That ant seems to be mattering about something.
yeah,
And
yeah.
boy, the smell of the magnolias in the spring is like
Hmm.
a total delight. I could just matter about that right now.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it's sort of puzzling to me that one would land there. And this isn't an attack on Steve. I think plenty of people land there. So I have that reaction of like, wow, who hurt you?
Hmm.
Like why didn't you get loved enough here to like help you
Hmm.
to see that you get to pick what you do from there.
Hmm.
You don't have to have any sort of like, I followed my own rule and now I did the thing and see how it matches the thing that I said I was going to do. Like,
I see, I
I
see.
mean, okay, you could approach it that way. And there's nothing about an interbehavioral perspective that says you cannot assign a goal and then correspond, your products of your analysis to that goal. It's not actually, I think, in contrast with a functional contextualism. I'll tell you where it became really important to me to understand this perspective in a deep way. And what I mean is to sort of enact or embody this perspective and to practice, like,
Hmm.
and applying it and sort of using it or living it. It was in clinical work.
Yeah, okay.
Um, because what are we doing? I mean, we have this sort of interaction. I'm going to assume like one-on-one therapy. That's the format that I mostly do intervention work. So, I've got this human and they've got this unfolding, constantly changing behavioral stream. And if things are going right, I'm context. So I'm this sort of, my behavioral stream is this flow of context. Again, if things are going right, our two behavioral streams are co-varying, they are
Hmm.
convolving together, right? They're constantly unfolding. And my job, the way that I understand it as a therapist, is to elaborate it, is to bring more expansiveness into that convolution, into those functional relations. So I actually add an idea to the psychological event that I think is practically really useful if you want to intervene on behavior. And that's the idea that there's a dimension in the formula called C, and it's basically saying that all of the functional relations are unique for this
Hmm.
moment. Like the event itself, the interbehavioral field is unique now and now
Okay,
and
yeah.
now and now, right?
Hmm.
And so I think we can understand as a characteristic of C, or as a characteristic of the functional relations as they're unfolding now and
Hmm.
now and now. I think we can understand that along a dimension from aversive to appetitive.
Okay.
And then we can think about that whole field as to what extent does that field compress? To what extent does what can be context become constricted? To what extent does your repertoire constrict and you don't have that experience of freedom, perhaps? Even your medium of contact get little.
Yeah,
The aspects
yeah.
of your history that are relevant, become tight and rigid. That rigidity that we name when
Hmm.
we say psychological inflexibility, I think we're naming that idea that can occur. Versus at the other end, we can think about the functional relations across that whole interbehavioral field as being appetitive, as
Yeah.
having this breadth and flexibility. So if we have these two unfolding behavioral streams, ideally co-varying, I want to
Yeah.
be context for
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
client, I want them to be context for me. These two unfolding behavioral streams co-varying, I think my job is to introduce into that interaction something that is aversive but matters to them, like
Uh-huh.
an aversive that shows up in their life, and to have enough support, enough appetitives in just our interaction that it can tolerate the introduction of that aversive without them leaving or shutting down or zoning out, right? So this appetitive interaction between us, the introduction of something sort of aversive enough that it's going to matter, and then inviting expansion of that interbehavior, expansion of that repertoire right here in the moment. Can you do that? What
Hmm.
that pulls
Hmm.
for,
Hmm.
and also notice, what it's like to be looking at me right now, and also feel what's unfolding in your body, and also notice how your mind is getting busy here, or notice a feeling that sort of is rising and falling. And did something just shift? Because it looks like something just shifted. right? And to find sort of this sweet spot in our interaction where it's aversive enough, the learning is aversive enough that's going to matter,
Hmm.
but appetitive enough that it's flexible, that we
Hmm.
are, still interacting, still co-varying, and that you can move with some ease amongst different aspects of your
I see.
experience. And so trying to do that without interbehaviorism, just going, of course, if they're stimulating, there's responding, or of course, a
Yeah.
reinforcer is just, only a reinforcer with respect to this one behavior. That doesn't fit my experience or my observations of watching an organism behave.
Yes. I see.
I needed that idea of the behavioral stream. I needed that idea of the history is right here. I don't have to guess about your history from
Yeah.
some other place. I don't have to guess about your private events because
Yeah.
I can learn to read the subtlety, the subtle bits of that behavioral stream just by interacting with you. And you know what? You can learn to read mine, where my intervention might be silence, or it might be that my head kind of comes together a little bit, or that I bite my lip. And we might have spent so many moments together in this place that you go, I know, it's just hard, you know, because you can feel sort of the thing that I'm inviting you to without me even saying it. I didn't have any way from a behavioral perspective, from an ACT perspective, to talk about what I saw as like really fluent psychotherapeutic
I see.
intervention.
I
I
see.
couldn't watch what I or experience or do what I thought was real mastery, real fluency of those intimate interactions and go, oh, there's a good diffusion move, or like,
Yeah.
what are the relational frames that are, it was blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
That old idea for me of like, stop belittling it, like stop like chopping off all the important pieces so that you can feel like you've mastered that or made it
Interesting.
easy. It's not easy, it's complex. And that's okay because, there's a lot going on. And so it was to make sense of that. And to have a way of sort of writing that unfolding functional relationship, and to be able to honestly to be able to teach it to others,
Yeah.
to be able to relieve others from having to break things up into like A's, B's, and C's,
Yeah.
or categorize, well, are they fused or avoidant
Hmm.
right now? I
Hmm.
have to
Hmm.
know
Hmm.
which they are so I know which metaphor to give them. I felt like we were taking people's natural orientation towards others, natural skills at reading others, natural just ability to discriminate aversive from appetitive interactions with other people. We were sort of taking that and saying, like, forget all that. Here are a bunch of
Yeah.
rules that
Hmm.
you need to follow about how to do therapy. And I didn't know how to get somebody from the hexaflex or from a four-term contingency to what I saw as
I
really
see.
what is most powerful about psychotherapeutic interventions.
It sounds like you're focusing more on the quality of the experience
Mm.
instead of the or more than the outcome of the process,
Mhm.
right? Because
Mhm.
that's the thing that
Mm.
I find a little bit problematic in the I don't want to say in functional contextualism because in the end, the way I understand functional contextualism to me fits inter-behaviorism. I don't really have to change anything or drop anything, but the pragmatic, the functional aspect of it is not just oriented toward the sense of workability, but it's about that integration. Or I
Yes.
understand workability as a process of integration. In fact, if you look at
Yes.
etymology and things like that, you realize oh, that's what it is about. It's not just
Mm.
about meeting an outcome. That's what turns functional contextualism into a too mechanistic philosophy in the end. Um, so, but I have had times, periods when I started to wonder also, well, then maybe I can't really be part of this field anymore because I feel like
Mm.
there's no way I can do it that's not going to be mechanistic in the end.
Mm.
I don't want to tell people what to do. I don't want to focus on the result.
Mm.
Even in teaching was the same. Like the idea of having goals and establishing outcomes, evaluations felt less and less relevant. And it's
Mm.
unfortunate because it seemed like precisely in this job, everything becomes more and more evaluated and with smart goals
Mm.
and things. So I felt like I was going completely in the other direction. But I did not go to be inter-behaviorism directly. I crossed it at some point as I was exploring a lot of different things. And I knew it
Mm,
was something on the rise in our community. I watched some panel discussions from the conference. I think it was 4 years ago, so, some of which you were part of, with Linda Hayes and others. And I read a little bit some papers. I didn't really understand well at that time. More recently, I read Linda Hayes book on interbehaviorism, and now I feel like I understand it much better. Also because it's a primer, but also I think I understand better the concept better. But for me, it was more by exploring other disciplines, other things,
mm,
like arts, like sport and
mm,
physics and stuff like that. That I started to see something that was keep coming back,
mm,
and especially that relational nature of the process. So, long story short, I started to see the value, the functional value of contemplation,
mm,
and like you said, like co-evolving convolution. Like maybe that's my job, to be there with somebody else,
mm,
doing my thing for myself, and by doing my thing for myself includes caring about you, because that's what I'm doing right now.
mm,
I'm curious what you think of Carl Rogers in this regard, because it really seems
mhm,
like when we talk about this, we land with not only the way Carl Rogers used to do therapy, but also the way he conceptualized
mm,
human psychology and his approach. I've been influenced quite a lot by his work, also over the past few years, mostly by watching his videos. Honestly, I didn't even
mm.
read Carl Rogers, but I watched his videos, some interviews, and I'm like, yes, that really makes sense perfectly well. And I feel like you could translate it into interbehaviorism. I don't think I would change anything.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I really relate to that. I think especially for me, what stands out in the overlap is this kind of humility of the therapeutic stance. You know, this idea that people will learn if we can help to create the environment where their way of learning, I would say, is more appetitive. If we can strengthen their appetitive learning repertoire and make it to where they're better at orienting toward what is sweet or pleasurable or curious or evocative or exciting or, pleasant or whatever in the environment, even when there are things that pull for them to run. Like if they can get better at that kind of learning, then they'll learn. Like
Yeah,
they'll learn what they need to do. They'll learn whether they should keep talking to their mother or not, whether they should quit their job or not, whether they should, take up cello or, I mean, I couldn't possibly know. How could I know? They're existing in this really complex world. And so how is it that one comes to build an appetitive learning repertoire? I think by being in this place, it's sort of a soft place to land where they can interact with hard stuff and stretch out what they're able to
mm,
do there. And the more that you practice appetitive learning, the better that you are at it. So those ideas is really simple, not easy, I think, ideas
mm,
of unconditional positive regard, those ideas that people have everything that they need, that there's
yeah,
not like a new thing, like, oh, if only I could mind meld you these details, then maybe you'd be functioning better. And then this humility that I cannot possibly know
yeah,
what your most brilliant life looks like. I can't possibly know what the path is between you and that life. I can't possibly understand the pain involved in what I am asking of you.
yeah,
And sort of fully acknowledging that to me is a requisite part of being, intimately connected with another human.
yeah,
It's both like the openness to that connection and the humility that like I couldn't possibly, I couldn't possibly. So yeah, that's what kind of shows up for me.
yeah,
I mean, I think
yeah.
it's this way of loving that we mostly don't get, I think, in the rest of our lives. Like we mostly
That's an important point, and that's what got me not back, because I never left. really the field, but got me back to being passionate about it, and sort of again like this idea of surrendering to an experience and sort of something that feels evident, at least at this point, is that, well, there are still people who seem to be helped and need and seem to learn something from when they interact with me. So while I'm wondering if I should maybe I can keep doing that in the meantime, and then we'll see. And then it's like, well, yeah, it's something as I don't know, it's the ontological stance. I wonder on the most on a continuous level if I'm really making a difference. Perhaps
Mm,
the client, the student, the supervisor, the trainee would have just learned what they're learning. Maybe they would be doing just as fine without me.
mm,
But at the same time, I cannot know that for sure. And
yeah.
yeah, it is humbling. It's an interesting balance of being humble and empowered. You really don't know, but there is a quality of the experience. It's
Mhm,
like right
mhm.
now, I could be like, again, like, are we seeing something very really that interesting, that new, that this and that? But at least I can deny that I'm enjoying it, and there's
Yeah.
something that's happening for me. So if I can be true to that. Maybe that's, I don't know. I don't even know
Mhm.
if that's going to be useful, but I can at least be open to the possibility that there is a meaning to that.
Mhm.
There's a purpose to
Yeah.
it.
Well, and I think we can be hopeful. I mean, one of the things that I think really is cool about our verbal abilities or, our relational framing abilities would be something like we could pause right now
Mm,
and acknowledge all of the people that are like hearing our words and seeing our faces asynchronously. We
hmm.
could sort of imagine them in front of their devices or with their earbuds in. We could have hopes for how like our words and our connection might echo through their experience. For me, there's this sort of move, I think, that complements that, like, well, where am I at right now? And what am I enjoying or orienting to right now? And can that be enough? I think a complementary move is to also explode that, like
Yeah.
from the self-orientation and the appreciating my perspective to the sort of the all. I mean, we could appreciate the history of the people who have trained us and the ways that their different conversations and bits of suffering, positioned us
Hmm,
to
hmm,
to
hmm.
ask questions that led us here right now, led us to this moment right now, in part rejecting some of the things that they taught us,
Yeah.
with a
Yeah.
with a
Yeah.
confidence and a pleasure and a delight that they were part of, instilling in us and like creating the context for. So it's for me, I compliment like both of those. And I think it's a thing that comes up in therapy is like I can ground like way down to me right now. And as I'm interacting with you, and sometimes like that feels, important. And I can just be with you right now, or I can just invite this simple thing right now. And I don't have to fix all of the things.
Yeah.
And sometimes the move for me is also, or I can zoom way out and here we are, just two beings,
Hmm, hmm.
loving one another and caring for one another. And here I am caring for you and you being my sole focus in this tradition of people coming with their hands out saying, I need help. Like I don't know how to
Yeah.
do this myself,
Yeah. Yeah.
And like there's something really amazing about, I think, both being able to sink into this moment in my perspective right now and being able to explode that out to
Hmm, hmm.
to all these potential perspectives and to sort of let us appreciate that for a moment.
And it feels like a very good approach to address the issues that psychologists, therapists have been more concerned about lately, especially in the clinical psychology field, because if we consider more like social work field, or counseling, it's been a part of
Mm,
their interest for a longer time. But like the social context, the social justice, and basically like taking into account the broader context, the context outside the therapy room, outside the life of the clients at micro level, and take into account the whole background.
mm,
It's I've seen that in with students when I was still teaching and supervising, that they could feel overwhelmed with all the things that they had to take into account, all the things that they had to be educated with.
Mm,
And I felt like there was a trend that became, in my opinion, too mechanistic. Actually, it's like, oh, I need to know about sexual orientation, about gender, about
mm,
political issues and race and all these things to be a good therapist, to be a really holistic therapist. I need to know about that. But to me, what was missing was the integration of that. It was more like,
mm,
again, it was all the pieces, all the parts. I know about this, I know
mhm,
about that.
mhm,
But when you take, so yeah, could be inter-behaviorism or any kind of form of that's really holistic. To me, it feels like, no, you can work in this moment with the client now.
mhm.
you you're not just working on this, you're working on everything. It's like I keep seeing you make this gesture of expansion and connecting with everything. It's
Mhm.
not that you have to necessarily go through the list of all the important things or the
Yeah.
details of everything. It's because that's where you become mechanistic.
Mhm.
But it's
Mhm.
a stance of openness and stance of full integration. Does that make sense to you? I know you have also,
Yeah.
if I'm right, you also always had a um, I don't know if interest is the strong enough word, but let's say interest in social justice and taking
Mm.
into account the social background. Can you say a little bit about that and how
Yeah.
you're using this support, this philosophy in that service, if that makes sense to you?
100%. Yeah. I mean, I think this orientation or this way of looking at the world and this stance in therapy is practical with respect to social justice or interest in equity or
Mm,
interest in understanding positionality and privilege and power. Most recently, I've been thinking a lot about positionality and power and privilege. In terms of how it is that we can avoid harm to one another in situations like when we're teaching or when we're an employer or when we're, yeah, in a position where we have relatively more power than the other person. For me, the idea that we can actually, I could learn facts about you and learn facts about how those different features of us or our identities might interact and sort of add up the little bits
mm,
of your intersectional identity and the little bits of mine. But I think what's really, really important is in any one moment, can I sort of can I perceive in this moment right now if I am the person in the room with the most power and like
mm,
respond accordingly with responsibility to nurture the repertoires of the people around me, with responsibility to resource myself, that it is not my job or it's not my client's job or my student's job or my employee's job to resource me if I'm under-resourced, if my
mhm,
repertoire is
mhm.
narrow. I think these analyses or these concepts, I guess, are most useful when they're coupled with these, again, I think really practical analyses of privilege is a thing that it's a contextual element, right? It's an aspect of context that you can stop and assess at any one moment.
Yeah.
Positionality is a feature of your interbehavior, right? Your
Mhm,
behavior
mhm.
in context at any one moment. Power is not a thing you like walk around, three-quarters full of power. It's dynamic, it's
Yeah,
constantly
yeah,
changing
yeah,
depending on who you're interacting with. And the implications are huge. I might need to, if I get a scary email in class, I'm the teacher, so I'm the person with the most power in the room. It might be really important for me to step out and find a human that I'm not in charge of their grade to
yeah,
share that I need to take a moment to panic and I need them to help me
yeah,
for a second. And it's not about not admitting or acknowledging that we struggle to people that we're, in charge of or have more power than. It's about not putting the responsibility on them for them to manage our
yeah,
process because I think that is the bias. If I have less power than my mentor, right? If I'm interacting with my mentor and he is losing his patience, he's angry and upset, even if he's not angry and upset with me, everything in my body will say, calm the powerful human down.
Yeah.
Make them calm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Stop this from happening. This is dangerous. And
Hmm.
that person doesn't have to have ever threatened me or like hit me
Hmm.
or has said a mean word. Just the fact that the human with more power is, their repertoire is constricted and they are interacting in this way that's aversive with the world, like just that will orient me entirely towards making it better for them.
Yeah.
And that's like not an impact I want to have on
Hmm. Hmm.
anybody ever, unless the house is burning down.
Hmm.
If my
Yeah.
house is
Yeah.
burning down, I want my littles and my critters to go, the big one is scared,
Yeah.
run.
Yeah.
But there are very few circumstances. Like I am not working in a war zone. I am not an EMT. Like there are very few circumstances where that's the function that I want to have for
I see.
people. And so for me, like these questions of social justice or equity, DEI stuff, they're not remote concepts. They are aspects of functional relations
Hmm.
among humans that are unfolding constantly. And that if we don't empower people with ways of understanding them that are actionable, which in this case, I think an interbehavioral perspective is actionable. If we aren't empowering them, then they either reject the idea outright because they feel vulnerable, like how do what's to say they have privilege? Does that mean they've never suffered? Da 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 da
Hmm.
da. Or it's taken on as a sort of burden, like I'm not allowed to thrive or have to watch myself threat. At any point,
Yeah.
I could hurt somebody. When, I think we have access potentially to this really empowering way of understanding inequity, this really empowering way of understanding power, of taking up our power and using it, more effectively, of taking and of the importance of caring for ourselves and having a relationship with ourselves that allows
Hmm.
us to be more effective in relationships with people at all sort of levels of disparity and
Hmm.
power. Um,
Hmm. Following up on what you explained here, and I'd like to is a sort of last question. I'm aware
mm.
of the time, and
And my
basically,
very long answers.
yeah, I'm aware of that. So I'm aware of that amount of time for your answer. I'll let you manage how much you wanna say for that last one. It's not completely formulated in my mind, so that's why I'm using a bit of time to reflect at the same time. Uh, I guess it's like there's two threads there. One is I'm curious about how you deal in your everyday life, whether it's professional, but I'm also interested in your like more outside of your
Mm,
work. How do you manage when there's a discrepancy between your philosophy, your worldview, especially related to behaviorism, inter-behaviorism, ontology, all these concepts we talked about, and the worldview of people you interact with, whether it's like friends, family, or even at work, with colleagues, or because like we're having great, nice, easy conversation here, even if we disagreed on things, we could still rely on foundations, like you were saying
mm,
earlier. And you talked about the work in therapy, and of course, it's challenging, and sometimes we're not on the same wavelength as clients, of course, and all, but still, we're in like teaching, we're in control of the context in the sense that, you want to work with me, this is how I work, in the end. I
mm,
can adapt and all, but I'm going to be true to my philosophy and all. Same thing in teaching. You work for an institution, you already have to adjust to that.
mm,
But when it comes to life outside of work and interacting with people, and it can be, even like working for, like with other people on a cause, and maybe they agree with you on social justice and things like that, but maybe they approach it in a very ontological way. I've seen that
mm,
quite a lot. We
mm,
may have the same views about racism, about helping people who are oppressed and all, but it's not the same when people are ontological about it. There is a
yeah.
righteousness that come with it that can, at some point, become really problematic. And in fact, you can be perceived by the group or some people as a threat because you
Yeah.
might be perceived as too moderate, for example, too
Mhm,
nuanced. And
mhm,
it's, I mean, there's histories of stories like that in the history of politics. It can be dangerous to be nuanced, to be moderate when
Yeah.
people expect you to take a very strong stance. I believe you can be ontological and very strong. In fact, I do think that's the strongest stance, but it can
Mhm.
be misperceived. I've learned that there's also timing to express that nuance. That sometimes it's better to protect yourself and not say anything. And
Mm.
anyways, just random stuff here, but to wrap up and take as long as you want to wrap up. What are your thoughts on that? What's your experience like when you interact with the world outside of your
Mm.
work or in your work, but with people who have a different worldview? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think there's a few elements that come to mind. One is no, it's important for me to know when to hush and listen. Um, Yeah, and that's particularly important to me because I do have so many words to say about so many things. I always have a perspective. It's very rare that I don't know what I think about something, right? And I'm actually pretty interested in my thoughts often. So, the first tool I think, or the first aspect of my repertoire that feels important in those spaces is to listen. And it's not unlike, I think, a therapeutic stance, particularly if it's a new group or as a rule, a group where, I'm coming in with an identity that affords me with a bit more power. And this might be a space for people to share suffering that I'm buffered against or that I'm able to tolerate because I have a bit more power. The first thing might be for me to sort of hang back and listen and watch because there's this gift that I think we have in this functional perspective of like, I can tell where we are by watching how you move through this space.
Hmm. Hmm.
If I see you sort of cowering, like, what if I just assumed that this was a scary space and
Hmm.
I sort of respected and honored that? And if I see you like, pick up your sword and lunge, that like there's an attack happening, like something is threatening you in a way that sort of pulls for that. And in the same way that we might take sort of a humble, stance in our interactions with our clients, I think that can be a gift in spaces where communication is difficult, where people are angry and people are hurt and people are the victims of our manufactured contexts of scarcity,
Hmm.
where people are the scapegoats or taking the
Yeah.
brunt
Yeah.
of some of these systems that we have. It feels very important for me to be ready to watch and to listen and to understand where are we right now because I'm going to take your lead on where we are first. It doesn't mean that I don't have anything to offer, but I'm not sure maybe what I have to offer until I see where we are. I
Hmm.
mean, I don't want to bring a surfboard to a barbecue. I mean, I need to see, like I need to understand functionally the space that we find ourselves in, and also practical things like the norms of how people interact in this space, right? I'm not trying to bring my white lady tears to to the party necessarily. And so that's one sort of thing that I want to kind of keep in mind is there's so much value when people are generously sharing their perspectives and their lived experience, even if I experience those as rigid, even if I experience them as militant, even if I think they're asking me for, show us that you're a good guy, prove it. If
Yeah.
you're a good guy, you do this and you
Yeah. Yeah.
say this
Yeah.
and you think this. Well, it doesn't mean that I have to come back to that space. That might not be the place for me, right?
Yeah.
It might be that I unfriend that person on Facebook or that I find a space where like the things that I have to offer are more useful. I don't think that I don't think I can ever make there be less suffering by constricting my own repertoire in response to another person's constricted repertoire, right? Like be mad and rigid with us to show that you support us is not something that I think I have to offer. It may be that others have that to offer. I don't want to speak for sort of the world or all beings, but for me, constricting repertoires and demanding that that be the case across, anybody who supports or believes or cares about something, is dangerous because our repertoires are not particularly creative or innovative, or we can't share perspectives as easily when we're in that constricted space. But it's not to say that someone else's repertoire needs to be more elaborated. They
Mhm,
can only be
mhm,
where they are, right?
mhm, mhm.
So if I find myself in a place where I'm able to appreciate this nuance, or I'm able to exercise compassion towards someone committing atrocities, it's not to say that that is the correct perspective for other people to have, or that I won't learn something by allowing myself to really seep for just a moment into what it must be like to not have any access to that,
Mhm.
even if I'm typically like a really compassionate person or a really thoughtful, being. So one is, sort of that listening, one is exercising that I get to pick my relationship with, this particular community or person or space, that I can, once I've sort of seeped in and understood it functionally, that I can make a choice as to where my repertoire might be best suited. Um, Another is that quite often there are little places that I can sort of point and offer, a little bit of an enhanced perspective or a little bit of a different perspective. So I'll give you an example. And this is a work example, but just because it's the place that I interact with people who don't think like me probably the most. Um, and so like on these big university communities, people will sort of bang their heads about like, why aren't people doing this? Why aren't students doing this? Why aren't faculty doing this? And of course, our behavioral perspective is, well, they've done exactly the right
Yeah,
thing considering the context we have created, and we are the
yeah,
most
yeah.
powerful people on this campus. So
Mhm,
perhaps this
mhm.
is our problem. But I can't, I mean, I'm not just going to stand up and say, well, it's your fault.
Mhm.
That's not going to be very useful. But as you mentioned, like sort of ways to speak more effectively, it might be something like, well, what if we just assume that this is the behavior that we are resourcing,
Yeah,
and that, we could look for ways to resource other behaviors? What if we sort of empowered ourselves to take that
yeah.
perspective? So I've got like a whole community of people talking about resourcing graduate students to do this, resourcing
Mhm,
undergrads to
mhm.
do this, resourcing staff to be better at this or whatever. And it's a one word. It's just resourcing as a
Mhm.
verb. And suddenly, people start looking at things differently and start seeing different opportunities. Um, and I think kind of the last thing that I would say there is being kind of once a community has, I think, once I'm sort of part of a community, meaning like once we have a shared culture, and that could be a single friendship, or it could be a group of people that gets together for coffee, or a committee that I'm on, or a volunteer group. Like once I am sort of known and there's trust there, I think I think much in the same way that I might in any other space, I can be sort of unapologetic, and I'm like,
Mhm. Yeah,
me.
yeah,
You know me. I'm always
yeah.
asking
Mhm.
myself, like, well, what's in the context? You know me, it's always going to come back to the situation for me, or to a circumstantial perspective. I could talk about that a bit more, and a sort of like, y'all know this is how I see
So
the
you're
world.
still the student, the young student who was speaking up in the class, but with a little bit of
Yeah.
wisdom that
Maybe making sure I'm part of the community first.
yeah, yeah,
Is an
yeah, or
important
able to take
part.
care of yourself
Yeah.
and be okay with people's reaction and
Yes. Yes.
yeah,
100%.
yeah,
And okay, that if people feel like my perspective isn't useful,
yeah, yeah.
um, that's okay. And I think when we sort of unapologetically speak about the impact that we're trying to have and the perspective that we have, I think particularly if we're speaking with people with less power, there are things that we can do that invite feedback. And that if we earnestly and honestly and authentically invite that feedback. So, a practical example in a meeting where I'm talking about something that I'm not sure about
Mhm.
how to talk about this, and feels like there's different needs, and I could hurt you, but I could hurt you, and you kind of both are disempowered in
Mhm.
this moment because you're both in contact with different vulnerabilities, right? These things can come up, I mean, so easily. I might sort of say out loud, I might say, I'm not sure that I'm handling this. My
Mhm. Mhm.
intention is to honor all of these different perspectives and to sort of acknowledge the suffering on this hand that might be something like this, and also like give room for the pain that could be showing up around this. And if I would welcome any feedback, if I'm not quite hitting this right, it could be
Mhm.
now, it could be later. You could email me, you could talk to my
Yeah,
TA. Is there a person in the room who's happy to give Emily feedback? Raise your hand. Okay, so Susan over there is more than happy to give me some feedback if you don't want to tell me directly, but I'm not sure about what I'm saying here and how I'm
yeah,
doing this. I want you to trust me that what I'm intending to do is treat this
yeah,
with, love and regard. And so inviting that feedback to where that can be shaped in me, and to where people are intentionally stopping and going, do I feel okay about this? I can't tell you how many meetings I end by saying, if you think about this later and you don't feel right about it,
yeah,
like,
yeah,
just let me know.
yeah,
Like, just
yeah,
tell
yeah.
me.
I like
We
that.
we went to a new place. We
Yeah,
we talked about some hard things. I
yeah,
would never want you to leave this interaction and go, why did she say that? Or
yeah,
she kind of pushed me into saying I
yeah.
agreed with something I didn't.
And
And
you have
I've
time. You have
certainly
time
been
to
there.
process. If it's not just now,
Exactly.
maybe it's a few days or later. I wouldn't mind receiving an email from a student or client years after who told me, when you said this and that. I think it's
Oh,
great that it stays open.
what a gift. What
Yeah,
a gift, right?
yeah,
Like if we were all able to share, like, here's a function you're having that you might not,
yeah.
I imagine is not the
Well, and
function you think you're
it works
having.
both ways. I have memories of things that I rejected from some teachers, and now I understand, or therapists, I
Mm,
understand now. Didn't write to them because I didn't say anything, so there's not necessarily a point in doing that. But and there's something I find also spiritual about not necessarily having to say it, but feel it,
yeah.
in some way. And yeah, it's not over. The functions continue to transform. Knowing that can be also a good way of trusting that, like I said earlier, noticing is not just noticing, it's also a way of being in the room or in the space,
Mhm.
and that it can have an impact and maybe not immediately. Uh,
Mhm.
and you know what? I know to let you go, but we're going to have a moment of everything is connected. I swear I didn't plan. Let me see if I have it here. I think I have it here. Yes, I did. I received this week.
I got mine
Yeah,
yesterday
right. No, I
too.
mean, it's pretty cool because I didn't plan it at all, I swear. But everything you were saying, I was like, oh, but by the way, we both got to, I think, to review and endorse this book written co-authored by Danielle Moyer, who was one of our students. Your student first because she supervised her master thesis, but she was also one of my students. And how cool, how cool to
Right.
have the students who had their own career and now is writing a book. And so I think this is a great way of concluding our
I
episode
love it.
today. I feel like it's really like, yeah, the stream of contingencies keep going, and
Mm.
their own thing too. It doesn't have to be what we taught literally, but
Mm-mm.
just their own way. It's a really great book. I forgot to say it out loud for those who only listen, but the book I'm talking about is called "Saying the Wrong Thing," and it's a really cool book
It's
about
fantastic. Yeah.
how they say how to speak up in difficult, controversial, or emotionally charged conversation. I don't do this podcast to sell books. It's not my book, but it just happened. It was under my desk, and I'm like, not under my desk, like just because it's not even, and I'm using it as a block just because I thought of it. But my favorite books are under my desk, by the way. No, it's a really good book, and I recommend it. Thank you, Emily. Thank you so
Thank
much. Thank you
you.
for having so many words. This is why I like to have conversations with you. So thank you for your generosity, and
Well, I
just can't
appreciate
wait
you.
for the next conversation with you whenever it will be.
Me too. Thanks, Matt.
All right. Bye bye.
Appreciate it.